One night while lying in bed, unable to sleep, a memory resurfaced. It's something I occasionally think about or rarely retell, but tonight it struck me as particularly unsettling. Maybe because, as an adult, I can fully grasp the potential implications of what happened. I'm not sure if this story really fits here, but it's true nonetheless. I was around 13 years old, getting ready for school one morning. My dad was already at work, and I think my mom was getting ready for hers. Every day, I walked to school, as it was only about half a mile from home. I was ready and headed out the door, saying goodbye. I walked down the hill of our yard and along the curved street toward the school, just out of sight of my house but not far. I reached the end of my neighborhood, where I would cross the street and head toward the intersection near the school. Before I could cross, a worn-out black van pulled up in front of my path, stopping right at the edge of the road that runs parallel to my neighborhood. It was a vehicle I had never seen before, and I haven't seen it since. I looked at the driver. He was a pale man, probably in his 30s, with disheveled brown hair. But what really struck me were his eyes, dark circles under them, and a stare that made me feel extremely uneasy. His window was still up. He motioned for me to come closer with his hand. My heart started pounding. Every instinct was telling me this wasn't a good person. So I just stood there, shook my head no, and didn't move. A part of me was ready to run if he tried to get out of the van. But he didn't. He didn't even react to my refusal. He just stared at me for a moment before abruptly driving off, disappearing down the road. I don't remember what I did next, but I think I ran home instead of heading to school because I was so shaken. I told my mom either that morning or later in the day, and she informed my dad, who works as a police officer. He called me into the living room where he was on his work laptop and asked me to describe the man and the van. Unfortunately, I didn't have much useful information to give. Being a middle schooler who wasn't prepared to remember license plates or identify car models. As expected, my dad wasn't able to find out anything more about this man with the limited details I provided. The day passed, and the event became just an odd memory that no one had any reason to discuss again. Every so often, I'd recall the time that creepy man tried to beckon me toward his van, but only recently has the memory filled me with such deep dread. I can't help but wonder what might have happened if I had walked up to him. Would I have disappeared? Just another middle schooler who vanishes without a trace? No witnesses, just an unsolved mystery and a family left grieving forever. The thought of it sends chills down my spine, especially now that I understand what some people are capable of. Death isn't always the worst thing, or maybe it's all in my head. Maybe he just wanted directions or needed to ask something, even though his window was closed and he looked unwell, to say the least. The worst part is, I'll never know. Maybe it was just the heightened anxiety of a kid blowing things out of proportion. But all I know is that every part of me was screaming that something was wrong. Remembering how it felt to look into his eyes, I can't shake that feeling. And what's even more terrifying is the thought that before or after he encountered me, he might have beckoned to a kid who didn't shake their head no. Working as the night auditor at a well-known hotel, I had the chance to meet many interesting people. It always seemed like the insomniacs who wandered out of their rooms at night were the most fascinating. During my time there, I realized that everyone has a story, and there's one in particular that I'll never forget. There was an older woman, probably in her late 60s, who was a retired nurse from the psychiatric hospital downtown. Every night she stayed at the hotel. She would come down to chat with me at exactly 3:25 a.m. I always looked forward to seeing her, not just because of her amazing stories, but because that was the time when I struggled the most to stay awake. Most nights, she would tell me about her children or grandchildren, and occasionally she'd share stories from her past work. Some of her patients were still at the hospital, so she had to be careful not to reveal any identifying details. One night, when she came down, she seemed deeply troubled. By this point, I'd been talking to her for about a month. Her house had flooded, and she was staying at our hotel until repairs were completed. I asked her, "What's wrong?" She hesitated, staring off into the distance for a few seconds. It was clear that something was haunting her. Eventually, she turned to me and said, "Let me tell you about an old patient of mine." I replied, "Of course." and made us a fresh pot of coffee. It was our routine to move to the lobby couches, where it was more comfortable. We'd stay up drinking coffee until it was time for me to prepare breakfast for the other guests, and then she would head back to her room to try and get some rest. There was a man who was transferred to my ward shortly after I started working there. Most days, he was very polite, and you wouldn't have guessed that anything was wrong. She began. We both took a sip of our coffee, and she continued, "That man passed away last week." I offered her my condolences, and she added, "When I said most days, there were times when he would have fits of uncontrollable rage. He'd shout, kick, and scream seemingly nonsensical phrases, and we'd have to restrain him and administer sedatives to calm him down." She had never shared anything like this before, and I was intrigued. Then she said, "Today, while I was at the store, I heard his voice behind me, saying the usual nonsense. Black car, oak tree, yellow jacket. When I turned around, I only caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of my eye before he disappeared. I didn't think much of it and kept shopping. When I finished and started loading groceries into my car, a man wearing a yellow jacket in a black Camaro stopped next to me and asked for directions to the nearest gas station. Remembering my former patient's words, I felt a little spooked but brushed it off as a coincidence. I gave the man directions and he drove away. A few minutes later, as I was driving back to the hotel, traffic became terrible. As I inched along the street, I saw police cars speed past me, followed by a fire truck and an ambulance. When I reached the source of the traffic jam, I was horrified. The man from earlier had apparently lost control of his vehicle and crashed into a tree. An oak tree, to be exact. I remember not knowing what to think. I muttered, "Maybe it was just a coincidence?" She smirked, sensing my attempt at comfort, and replied, "Perhaps." Before we knew it, my alarm went off, signaling it was time to get breakfast ready. She took her coffee and headed back to her room. A day or two passed, and she seemed to have accepted the events as mere coincidence and moved on. But then came Friday, the last time I would speak to her before my work week ended. When she came down, she had that same horrified look on her face. We sat down, got some coffee, and started talking as usual. She quickly said, "I was in my room watching TV this morning when I thought I heard his voice again." He screamed in that frantic, delusional tone I remember from the ward. FedEx, 6, cul-de-sac. I jumped out of bed, searched my room, and found nothing. When I went to turn off the TV, I saw a glimpse of him on the patio. I started toward the door, but by the time I got there, he was gone. At this point, I was just as startled as she was because I knew what she was going to say next. Later, as I was eating dinner and watching the news, I saw a story about a shooting in Houston. It was a FedEx employee seeking revenge on his ex-wife. This man managed to kill 6 of her family members but was caught before he could find out where she was. The news showed the man's vehicle surrounded by police in a neighborhood cul-de-sac. I had seen this story earlier that night on the lobby TV, as I often spent most of the night watching the news to pass the time. I didn't know what to say. I sat there, waiting for her to speak again, but she just went back to her room early that night. I was worried about her because by this point, I had come to see her as a mother figure. After my shift ended, I spent the weekend trying to figure out what was happening with that poor woman. I remember thinking, is she just imagining things? Surely, she's making this up. Despite my doubts, I had never known her to lie. She was always so genuine when we talked. I looked forward to returning to work to see how she was doing. Come Monday, she didn't come down as usual. I checked the guest list to see if she was still checked in, and she was. Assuming she needed some space, which was understandable, I left her alone. She didn't come down again until Thursday, when she had yet another encounter with the man who was haunting her. This time, she didn't tell me what she had seen or heard. She just tried to make small talk and forget what was going on. I was worried, but I respected her need for privacy and continued with the light conversation. Before she went back to her room, I told her, "I'm worried about you, you know? I'm always here if you need to talk." She gave me a half smile and said, "I know, and thank you for listening." The next day, when I came in for work, The front desk clerk told me that the guest in room 406 had checked out earlier that day. I was shocked. I couldn't understand why she would leave without telling me. Her insurance had booked her for another 3 weeks. Where could she have gone? That night, as I was walking the halls to stay awake, I noticed a piece of paper on the floor by the elevators. I picked it up to throw it away when I noticed it had her handwriting on it. The hurried nature of the note concerned me. It read, "Iron Horse, Clearwater, Field of Flowers." I found it strange that she had taken the time to write this down and that whatever these words meant had caused enough panic for her to leave. We weren't the only store left in the mall. There were about 6 small shops in total, scattered along the different wings of this wagon wheel-shaped building. Ours was the only one in this section, though. Sometimes the other stores would close early due to the lack of foot traffic. Couldn't blame them. With most of the storefronts dark and much of the mall lighting malfunctioning, it could get pretty dim at night. I had never closed the store before, but at least Jess was supposed to be there with me. She was kind, upbeat, and always willing to help, but Jess never showed up. She didn't call or message, which was unlike her. Worried, I called our manager, Alex. His response was, "People just don't want to work anymore. You can close up on your own. It'll be fine." He dropped off the extra key, muttering something about work ethic as he left. I held back from saying anything. I knew Jess, and I knew she and her family were struggling financially. She worked hard, and she'd never skip work without a good reason. Even so, I was sure she'd let us know if something came up. And that's how I ended up where I am now, knees pulled to my chest, phone on silent with the screen dimmed, waiting for sunrise. Not alone. I wish I were. I'm hoping whatever's out there isn't a fan of sunlight because it's so pale, almost see-through. So, how did I end up here, you ask? We hadn't had a customer in 2 hours, and the mall was darker than I expected. No wonder we hardly got any business after dark. If you were driving by, the whole mall would look closed. I wished we had some background music to break the silence, but the sound system, like most things in this place, was broken. I kept busy dusting and getting everything ready for the morning. It was a good way to pass the time and cut through the silence with some noise. Eventually, I stepped out of the store and locked the gate so I could take a quick bathroom break. I wrote up a little "be right back," smiley face, sign to stick on the gate, though I doubted anyone would see it. The green exit sign flickered at me before giving up and going dark. The only sounds were the buzzing from the dying sign and the echo of my own footsteps. I jumped when I caught a pale figure out of the corner of my eye behind the glass of one of the closed stores. I turned sharply, but it was just the faint neon light from the distant, empty food court reflecting off an old mannequin. Nope, I thought as I hurried to the bathroom. Why are mall bathrooms always at the end of such long hallways? I suddenly wished I had brought my phone, if only for a bit of light. The bathroom itself was bright and reassuring, but as soon as I entered a stall, a raspy whisper from outside made me jump. "Please, I'm scared," the voice said. "What?" I whispered back, nervously. Silence. When I went to wash my hands, all the stalls were open, and it was quiet. I hadn't heard anyone come in or leave. I thought I heard a choked sob from behind me, but I told myself it was just my imagination. The bright bathroom made the hallway seem even darker when I stepped back out. As I reached the end of the hallway, I heard the door to the other bathroom across the hall open and close behind me. I reminded myself that the mall wasn't actually abandoned, so it wasn't strange for someone to come out of the restroom. But what concerned me was the strong stench that filled the hallway, like rotting food left in the sun for days. I tried not to gag and quicken my pace, hoping to put some distance between me and the smell. I thought I heard a wheezing noise, like someone struggling to breathe. I didn't look back. On my way back, I glanced at the store with the mannequin that had startled me earlier. The store was empty now. Nope. I sprinted back to my store, the wheezing and a shuffling sound following me from a distance. My hands were shaking as I struggled with the gate, but I finally got it open. I slid under and quickly locked it behind me. If anyone came by, I'd just unlock it to let them in. I felt a lot safer with the gate locked behind me. I drummed my fingers on the counter and noticed they were dirty. It looked like dried blood, patterned as if it came from the gate. It was thicker, darker, not fresh. I tried to convince myself it wasn't blood, and even if it was, there had to be a logical explanation. I went to the back to find some paper towels. I was not going back to that bathroom. I had calmed down a bit when I heard what sounded like someone shaking the gate. Oops, maybe we did have a customer after all. By the time I got to the gate, there was no one there. If they complained to Alex, I'd never hear the end of it. I felt guilty too. I always tried to provide great service, but I was so unnerved that I wasn't at my best. I approached the gate. "Hey, I'm sorry, we're open," I whispered into the darkness. Silence, but I thought I heard that faint wheezing again. I craned my neck to look down the corridor. In the dim light from the food court, I could just make out a tall, pale figure in the distance. Someone from one of the other stores must have been messing with me, moving mannequins around. Great, but as I stared, the purple neon light illuminated it enough for me to see that its arms and legs were too long, its torso too short to be any mannequin I'd ever seen. The pale arms ended in long fingers stained dark. The exit sign above it flickered weakly. Flash, flash, flash. In each flicker, I saw its face. It wasn't looking at me, but I could see slits where its nose should be and a long, wide mouth. I jumped back, accidentally rattling the gate. His head jerked toward me. Great. Flash, flash, flash. It was getting closer. I ran and tried to jump over the counter, but ended up tripping and crashing into a display. I didn't bother to fix it. I just curled up behind the counter. My pants were torn, and I had scraped my knee and elbow, but I was okay. Alex is never going to let me hear the end of it for knocking the display over. It's still out there. I can't see it, so I hope it can't see me, but I can hear it wheezing, that low, guttural heat, right outside. Right now, it's rattling the gate, scraping its long fingers down the bars. I'm starting to wonder if maybe Jess didn't just skip work. Maybe she never left the mall after she locked up last night. I'm not going home tonight. I'm waiting until sunrise, and I'm never closing again.
I recently experienced my first episode of sleep paralysis. I'd always heard about it, but never really believed it was real. I have an old digital clock radio on my nightstand that dimly lights up my room. I remember opening my eyes at 2:03 a.m. and trying to reach for the glass of water beside me. But I couldn't move. My entire body felt like it was locked in place, as if I were filled with cement. I tried with all my strength to move, but I was completely stuck. The only part of me that could move was my eyes. I started to panic. I'm not sure if I was imagining it, but I remember seeing a short, dark, faceless figure standing at the foot of my bed. It moved slowly from left to right, and by then I was sweating. I couldn't even scream to get my roommate's attention. I glanced at the clock again. It read 2:06 a.m. The figure kept moving slowly and raised a claw-like hand toward the top of my blanket. I was terrified and had no idea what was happening to me. I kept trying with all my strength to get up, but nothing worked. I closed my eyes and repeated in my head, "This isn't real," over and over again. Then suddenly, as if whatever was holding me down had vanished, I sat up straight, screaming, and the figure was gone. My roommate rushed in to find me crying and drenched in sweat. I turned on the light and frantically searched the room for the figure I had seen. I must have looked crazy to my roommate. I checked the clock again, and it was 2:20 a.m. Those 17 minutes were the most terrifying of my life, and I struggled to sleep for the rest of the week, afraid it might happen again. Was this sleep paralysis? What was that figure? Has anyone else experienced something like this? This version maintains the eerie experience while avoiding specific names and language that might be associated with copyright. This happened in January of 2016, when I was in my late teens. This story keeps coming up in my friend group, and something about it still bugs me. I have no idea what I really saw. It just seemed beyond explanation, almost paranormal. I live about 2 hours away from an abandoned campus that used to be both a tuberculosis hospital and an asylum until the 90s. I didn't really research it, and I didn't believe in the paranormal at the time. I just thought it would be cool to explore an abandoned place. So I brought along two guy friends, one my age who was into the paranormal and had been there before, and one older than us, and one girlfriend. I'm also a girl. The place is known for being off limits, so we hid my car and snuck in through a broken fence. We went around 8 or 9 p.m., so it was already dark. At first, we explored the main building without any issues. Nothing felt strange. But after leaving that building and entering another one, we somehow ended up right back at the exact spot where we'd exited the first building, and that felt a bit unsettling. So we decided to check out the basement. My girlfriend and I immediately felt uneasy and suggested we go upstairs instead, which we did. We found ourselves in a section that seemed to have been for children. There were toys scattered on the ground, and there was a soundproof room. Some of the toys were moving, and we even saw a ball bouncing. Our friend who had been there before stopped us as we walked down a hallway. We heard a door slam and footsteps ahead of us. The hallway in front of us was completely pitch black, while the rear was at least a little lit by the moon. We turned around and headed back. Against our better judgment, we let the guys convince us to explore the basement. As soon as my friend stepped onto the basement floor, her flashlight went out, and we couldn't get it to turn back on, no matter what we tried. It did come back on later, but not until we had left the premises. My phone, which was at 80%, immediately died. We were standing together in the center of the room, and it felt like there was a haze surrounding us. I started to feel sick and lightheaded, with a deep sense of dread, and my friends felt it too. It was like we were surrounded by other people. We quickly decided to head back upstairs. Then things got even more unsettling. We entered a ballroom and sat on a table, one of us at each corner. We heard a door slam, and I instinctively looked up at the ceiling to avoid glancing around the room. My friend, who was into the paranormal, started trying to communicate with whatever was in the room. He asked it to knock once if you're a boy and twice if you're a girl, and we heard a single knock. As this was happening, I saw a dark, almost human-shaped figure sitting in the windowsill. It was hunched over and looked tall, with one leg swinging. Then it suddenly took off, crawling across the ceiling. I tugged on my other guy friend's arm, and he shook his head, signaling me not to acknowledge it. My girlfriend started to say, "Do you guys see?" But my friend who was ignoring it cut her off, telling her to stop. The friend trying to communicate with the entity told it to come sit down. We felt the air grow cold, and that's when he said, "We have to go. Goodbye. You're not to follow us out." We all jumped up and walked out. Once we were outside, we practically ran to the car and left in a hurry. As soon as I got in the car, I felt physically better. In the car, we were silent for a while, but then my friend who had been ignoring the figure asked, "Did you guys see it?" We all said yes and shared what we'd experienced. He thanked my girlfriend and me for understanding his signal to ignore it as much as possible. This still freaks me out to this day. I get chills just writing or talking about it. The amount of energy needed to manifest something like that is what boggles my mind the most. I'm not even sure what we saw, and no matter how much we discuss it, we can't come to a solid conclusion. Was this something dark or demonic? What else could it have been? I'm open to all suggestions. I just felt I had to share this with people who wouldn't think I'm out of my mind. This summer, I went camping in a remote area of northern Arizona. The region has a rich Native American history, which will be relevant later. My dad, my younger sister, and I decided to leave our campsite early and hike down the mountain to visit some relatives who lived in a small, isolated community nearby. Calling it a town is generous. You know how, on a long drive, you sometimes pass through a place with a gas station and a small, slightly outdated grocery store, and you wonder, who actually lives here? There aren't many houses around, and it feels like a place that was once part of something bigger but has since been forgotten. That describes the area where my relatives lived. Their home was down the road from a gas station and a fast food joint, down another dirt road, and through a few more turns until you found where people lived. It was like a hidden neighborhood, with houses separated by large plots of land. There's a rancher's life out in this valley. Everyone is related in some way by blood, marriage, or deep friendship. It's a quiet, tucked-away corner of the world that you wouldn't know existed unless you knew someone who lived there. My relatives had recently moved into a beautiful wooden cabin in this secluded spot. We stayed for 2 nights, and something happened on the last night that I still think about often. After a late-night card game with my cousins and sister, we were all tired and ready for bed. It was dark, and everyone else in the house had already gone to sleep. The only light on was in the kitchen, where moths swarmed the window and back door, attracted to the glow. After we finished the game, I volunteered to take the deck of cards out to the back porch. Since my relatives hadn't unpacked everything yet, they had left their game boxes out on the porch. I stepped outside, all alone in the quiet night, and bent down to rearrange the stack of games to make it look a bit neater. My back was turned to the thick brush and trees surrounding the cabin. Bugs buzzed around me, drawn to the dim porch light. That's when I heard it, a faint whistling sound. At first, I thought it was my dad, because it was the same whistle he always used to signal us when it was time to leave, like at a family gathering or party. It's one of those small, familiar things in life that you never really think about, something comforting and unspoken. I quickly glanced at the window beside me, expecting to see my dad, but there was no one there. I was certain he was asleep inside. The whistling repeated several times, and although I wasn't scared, I was definitely puzzled. Still hunched over the box of games, I briefly turned my head toward the forest, but despite my curiosity, I knew it was time to go back inside, which is kind of ironic, considering the whistle's usual meaning. I walked inside and went to bed without mentioning the incident to my cousins. I didn't want to scare them. Even after we left the area, I didn't say much about it. Whatever or whoever was whistling, so softly that only someone familiar with that exact sound would recognize it, knew something deeply personal to me. I don't really believe in the supernatural or much folklore, but I often wonder why I heard that whistling that night and who or what was making it. A part of me suspects it could be something akin to a legend I've read about, maybe a being from Native folklore. That region, as I mentioned, is steeped in Native American history and culture. While I respect the folklore and find it fascinating, I'm not sure what to make of that experience. I just know that it's something I'll never forget. For some background, my family and I moved into our current house when I was around 3 years old. It's a 2-story home, built in the early 2000s. The second floor has 3 bedrooms. The master bedroom is to the left of a small walkway at the top of the stairs. Next to it, on the right, was the room my younger sister and I shared when we were little. The last room, at the end of the hallway, was meant to be my younger brother's room when he got older, but it mostly stayed empty and was used for storage. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, I developed a routine after school. I take a shower and then go to my parents' bedroom to watch PBS on their TV. They had the biggest TV in the house, and the picture quality was way better than the other ones. The TV sat on a large dresser in front of their bed. My sister, who is a little over a year younger than me, usually joined me to watch whatever was on. We especially loved watching Curious George, so we'd always try to be ready and dressed by 3:50 p.m. because the show started at 4 o'clock. I never really felt anything strange about the room, at least not during the day. But once it got dark, I always had an uneasy feeling about it. Even now, at 20 years old, I can't walk by that room late at night without getting the chills. It always felt off, especially when I was younger. I hated being upstairs alone, even during the day. However, on this particular day, for some reason, I was up there by myself. It was around October or November, and they were airing a special hour-long Curious George episode. I can't remember if it was a Halloween or Thanksgiving special, but I loved it enough to sit up there alone and watch it. I was about 15 or 20 minutes in when I heard a noise in the hallway outside the room. I thought it was my sister, so I ignored it. After a while, my sister came in and stood right in front of the TV. She had this habit of standing right in front of the screen and blocking everyone's view. Although she wasn't really blocking my view this time, I knew my mom didn't like it when she did that. She always said it was rude, but in that moment, I didn't care. There was a funny scene she had missed, and I started to tell her about it, expecting her to laugh. But she didn't respond, which annoyed me a little, so I repeated myself. Still no response. She just stood there, staring at the TV and away from me. Since I was sitting on my mom's bed and the TV was in front of me, all I could see was her back. After the third time she didn't respond, I got irritated and yelled her name, telling her to stop ignoring me and to look at me. That's when she turned around, except it wasn't my sister. It looked just like her, wearing the same clothes and everything, but the eyes were different. They were completely black, and her expression was blank, emotionless. We stared at each other for a moment before she, or whatever it was, turned around and walked out of the room. I was confused and a bit uneasy, but then I got angry because I felt like I had been ignored. I got up and walked out of the room, yelling for my mom, telling her that my sister had just ignored me and left me talking to her like a fool. My mom sounded confused when she yelled back that it couldn't have been my sister. My sister had been downstairs with her the whole time. I asked if maybe my sister had gone upstairs at some point without her noticing, but my mom insisted she hadn't, and even if she had, my mom would have heard the floorboards squeaking by her room. I was baffled, but I tried to convince myself that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Still, after that, I didn't feel comfortable being in that room by myself anymore, and I decided to stay downstairs with my mom for a while. I've experienced other strange things that I can't explain, but I often think about this one incident and wonder what it was that I talked to that day. If anyone has any ideas or guesses as to what it could have been, I'd love to hear them.
When I was 16, I started an apprenticeship in carpentry. Occasionally, when there wasn't much woodwork to do, I'd be assigned to work with a maintenance man, Dan, to help maintain various properties owned by the company. Dan was polite and hardworking, but he had an odd way about him. Sometimes he'd just stare off into space or suddenly switch topics, often bringing up my mom in conversation. For context, Dan had been married to my mom many years ago, and they had kids together. I'm not one of them. At first, I thought he was just being polite, asking about her well-being. But some of his questions were pretty intrusive, like, is her new partner nice to you? Or is she happy with him? These were questions that didn't seem appropriate to ask a 16-year-old. After a few months of working with Dan, I found out he was in a relationship with a woman who lived about 15 minutes away. I didn't think much of it and even expressed that I was happy for him, hoping it would stop the strange questions about my mom. But as time went on, I noticed something odd. Dan always took the same route to our jobs, even when it was out of the way. He'd drive slowly, almost as if he was looking for someone, and he'd barely speak during these drives. One day, Dan asked me a question that caught me off guard. How do you call someone when they've blocked your number? I told him the only way was to turn off your caller ID, but doing that would alert the person that you were calling anonymously. The question made me uneasy, like I was unknowingly involved in something wrong, but I brushed it off, telling myself that he could have easily found that information online. Then, one day, Dan left his phone open on the van's seat, and I saw a chat with multiple unsent messages to someone. The messages said things like, "Please talk to me. I don't know what I did wrong. And if you explain why you left, I won't contact you again. I just need an answer." I know I shouldn't have read them, and I wish I hadn't, but suddenly everything started to make sense. The strange routes, the messages, the questions about my mom, and the caller ID inquiry. I felt worried about who I was working with, so I talked to one of his children, who's also my sibling. She was shocked and said she'd talk to him about it, reassuring me not to worry. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been an unwitting accomplice by explaining how to contact someone who blocked him. I realized that Dan was a stalker. I eventually changed jobs, and a few months later, I saw an article about a stalker with Dan's full name. The article described a court appearance and a restraining order against him. It turned out he had been relentlessly messaging and calling his ex-partner, showing up at her door at night, sending her unwanted gifts, following her in the woods while she walked her dog, and even staging a coincidental meeting at the grocery store. He had gone so far as to vandalize his own van and try to frame her for it. He didn't tell his family about the court case until it was over. Dan was a secretive man, and I no longer have any contact with him. It just goes to show that you should trust your instincts about people. Anyone can have a hidden side. I hate to think how far he might have gone if his ex-partner hadn't taken action.
This story was shared with me by my mom, who heard it from my uncle before he passed away. Many years ago, my uncle worked in a factory that manufactured airplane engines. He held a pretty high position, managing a lot of the operations. The factory complex had several unconnected buildings, including an abandoned restroom block where my uncle would go to smoke since it wasn't allowed on site. One night, after a busy few hours, he decided to take a break and headed to his usual spot in the old restroom for some quiet time and a quick smoke. As he settled in, he suddenly heard a group of men having a heated argument nearby. This annoyed him because it was his usual spot, and he didn't want anyone else around who might report him. So he put out his cigarette and stayed quietly in one of the stalls, hoping they'd leave. As he listened, the argument got louder, and the men seemed really angry. At first, he couldn't make out what they were saying, and he started to get impatient, wanting to finish his break. Then, he distinctly heard someone shout, "Get out! Get out!" followed by other comments like, "This is ours." This confused him, as the place was supposed to be abandoned. The shouting soon escalated into furious screams, and my uncle decided he'd had enough. He opened the stall door, ready to confront whoever was there, but as soon as he did, the shouting stopped. Despite the darkness, he could see that the restroom was empty. There was no one else there, and he hadn't heard anyone leave. That's when it hit him. The angry voices weren't from any people. They were shouting at him to leave. He got out of there as fast as he could and never returned to that spot again.
Hi, I'm Nora, and I'm 15. My dad's mom, Mindy, who I call Grammy, is my favorite grandma. I stay at her house a lot, and so does my little sister, Rose. When I turned 12, my mom started letting me stay home alone, which usually meant I was in charge of watching Rose when the adults were out. About a year ago in May, during Memorial Day, a big family holiday for us since my Grampy, 1927 to 2019, was a World War II veteran. My Grammy went out to refill her arthritis medication and pick up some groceries. All my cousins, Aiden, Lola, Renee, Zoe, Anna, Carson, and Jimmy, were there along with Rose. The parents had gone out together, leaving Aiden and me in charge since we're the oldest. In the basement of Grammy's house, there's a room with sleeping bags and bunk beds where my cousins and I sleep during sleepovers. I was watching YouTube shorts on my phone while the younger kids played, and Aiden was playing with them too. Zoe, who's 4, asked for a snack, so Aiden went upstairs to grab her something. After a few minutes, all the little kids started complaining that they were hungry. It had been about 10 to 12 minutes since Aiden went upstairs, so I called him. He answered, saying, "Grammy is here, but her car isn't." I told Rose to watch the kids and stay put because she's the oldest of the little ones, and I ran upstairs as fast as I could. I saw Grammy, with her curly gray hair and black glasses, calmly unpacking a brown paper bag with tomatoes, onions, and other fruits and veggies. I told Aiden, "What do you mean? It's just Grammy unpacking the groceries." Aiden replied, "Well, her car isn't here, and she won't talk to me when I say her name. Even Cookie won't go near her." Cookie is Grammy's Persian cat. I looked outside, and sure enough, her car wasn't there. Grammy only has one driveway since she lives in the suburbs of a large town. I asked, "Grammy, can I help unpack the groceries?" But she didn't respond. Aiden and I went back downstairs, and then Aiden got a call from Grammy saying she was just about home. We both got chills. When we went back upstairs, whatever it was had vanished, and Grammy pulled into the driveway. It still sends chills down my spine every time I think about it.
Hey everyone, I'm Dakshan, and I'm 15 years old. For the past 2 years, I've been living in a small, picturesque village that feels like something out of a storybook, except, well, with a few eerie twists. I moved here in the fall of 2022, and while the reasons for the move aren't really important, what's been happening since then definitely is. So, buckle up, because I've got some strange tales to share. Let me set the scene for you. My village is pretty tiny, with mostly private houses and cottages. It's nestled at the foot of a mountain, surrounded on all sides by a dense, almost impenetrable forest. The only way in or out is a small bridge that spans the highway, about 3 kilometers from the nearest town, where the closest supermarket is. On one side of the village, there's a road that winds through the forest and leads to a slightly more populated area, but other than that, it feels like we're cut off from the rest of the world. In short, I live in what feels like the middle of nowhere. Now, when I say there's not much to do around here, I mean it. The village's only entertainment is a small bar, which, unsurprisingly, is the local hangout spot for the few people who live here year-round. There's also a section of the forest that's designated for legal wild boar hunting. We're in Spain, and wild boars are pretty common here. But aside from that, there's really not much else. I spend most of my time playing video games, drawing, and occasionally exploring the village and its surroundings. And it's during these explorations that things started getting, well, weird. My house is on the very edge of the village, which means the forest is practically in my backyard. Just 10 meters from my front door, the trees start to thicken, and from the balcony in my mom's room, you can see straight into the forest. On the first day we moved in, I was curious about what lay beyond those trees, so I decided to check it out. It was mid-afternoon, and the light filtering through the trees made everything look almost magical. I ventured deeper into the woods and eventually stumbled upon a wide open area. A sort of steppe dotted with olive trees and a few small, crumbling stone houses that looked like they hadn't been lived in for years. At first, it seemed like just another part of the forest. But then I saw something that didn't quite fit. Right in the middle of the steppe, there was an old, burnt-out car. It looked like it had been there for ages, with the metal rusted and twisted. What struck me as strange was that there were no signs of how the car got there. There weren't any tire tracks or paths leading to it, and the area around it was untouched. It was as if the car had just dropped out of the sky and landed there. Even weirder, the next day when I went back to the same spot, the car was gone. All that was left was a blackened outline in the dirt where it had been. Couldn't wrap my head around it. How does a car just disappear like that? As you can imagine, this got me feeling a bit uneasy about the forest, especially at night. I've always had a bit of a fear of dark forests. It's not just the darkness that scares me, but the thought that something or someone could be out there, hiding, watching. Normally, I try to avoid going near the forest after sunset, but sometimes when my dog needs to go out, I have no choice. I always make sure to bring a powerful flashlight to keep an eye on her, and I never stray too far from the house. One night, not long after we moved in, my mom was working late, so it was just me and my dog at home. I was up late drawing when my dog started whining to go outside. Reluctantly, I grabbed my flashlight and headed out with her. We walked toward the edge of the forest, which is where I usually take her to do her business. Everything was quiet, just the usual nighttime sounds. Crickets, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I shone my flashlight around, keeping an eye on my dog as she sniffed around. Then, out of nowhere, something darted through the beam of my flashlight, just about 10 meters away from where my dog was. My heart nearly stopped. Whatever it was, it moved fast. Too fast to be anything normal, like a rabbit or a deer. It was just a blur in the light, but it was enough to send me into a full-blown panic. I scooped up my dog and sprinted back to the house as fast as I could, slamming the door behind me and locking all the locks. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Could it have been a wild boar? Maybe, but wild boars don't usually come that close to people, and they definitely don't move like that. To this day, I have no idea what it was, but just thinking about it gives me chills. Life in this village is usually pretty quiet, almost too quiet if you ask me. I rarely see cars driving by, and the streets are mostly empty, except for the occasional person heading to or from the bar. Even though I know some of the houses here belong to people who live in big cities and only visit occasionally, it still feels strange. I've been to other villages with the same population, but those places were lively, with people walking around and kids playing in the streets. Here, it's like the whole village is holding its breath, waiting for something. There are times when I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. It's not all the time, but sometimes when I'm out walking or even just sitting in my room, I get this weird sense that there's someone, or something, keeping an eye on me. I know it sounds paranoid, but it's hard to ignore. Maybe it's just my imagination running wild, or maybe there's more to this village than meets the eye. Anyway, I could go on, but I think I've rambled enough for now. My mom's calling me, so I've got to go. but I've got plenty more stories to share about this strange, quiet place and the forest that surrounds it. If you're interested, stay tuned, because there's definitely more to come. Until then, thanks for listening, and take care.
This is a story that happened to my friend's grandfather, who I'll call Joseph, back in the 1960s in California. Joseph was a hardworking taxi driver, and he had just returned from serving in Vietnam a few months before this event. One day, while driving down a secluded road surrounded by trees, Joseph noticed a man on the side of the road sticking out his thumb, hoping to hitch a ride. Being the kind person he was, Joseph decided to pull over and give the man a lift. The man who got into the taxi was short, with dirty long hair and a bushy beard. He spoke with a strange accent and gave off an unusual vibe. Joseph remembers the man saying, "Hey man, thanks for stopping. You're a good person." Joseph asked him where he wanted to go, and the man simply replied, "The nearest town, please." Joseph agreed and started driving. As they were on the road, Joseph tried to make some small talk with the man in the back seat. He asked, "Where are you heading?" The man responded, "I'm going to see some family." Joseph smiled and said, "That's nice. It's always good to see family." The man chuckled and said, "It sure is, man." Even though the conversation was casual, Joseph couldn't shake a strange feeling he had about this passenger. But he didn't think too much of it at the time. After driving for about half an hour, they finally reached the nearest town. Before parting ways, the man asked Joseph for his name, and Joseph told him. When Joseph asked for the man's name in return, the man simply said, "My name is Charlie." They both said their goodbyes, and Joseph drove off, not giving the encounter much thought. It wasn't until months later that Joseph saw Charlie on the news. To his shock, he realized that the man he had picked up that day was none other than the infamous cult leader, Charles Manson. Joseph was deeply disturbed when he discovered who he had driven around that day. He never told anyone about it for a long time because he thought people might not believe him or would think he was making it up. Joseph passed away in 2022, but a few months before he died, he shared this story with my friend and their family. Even years later, just thinking about that encounter with Manson would send chills down Joseph's spine. Whether people believe it or not, that experience left a lasting impact on him, and it's a story that his family will never forget. This story happened to a friend of mine when she was in middle school, and it's something that stayed with her for a long time. It was early in the school day, and she decided to excuse herself to go to the bathroom. While she was in the stall, the school's PA system suddenly chimed, announcing a lockdown, and it wasn't a drill. She said her heart sank, not knowing what to do next. She was torn between running back to her classroom, where the door might already be locked, or staying put in the bathroom, hoping to stay hidden. Fearing that the intruder might see her if she ran, she decided to stay in the stall, crouching on the toilet bowl to hide her legs from view. The school was eerily silent. My friend could almost hear her own heartbeat echoing in the quiet. But that silence was soon shattered when the bathroom door suddenly swung open, and she heard heavy footsteps entering. In that moment, she knew the person in the bathroom wasn't a teacher or a student. It was the intruder. She held her breath, trying to stay as still and quiet as possible, but it felt like time was standing still. After a while, the footsteps stopped, and there was a brief moment of silence. Just when she thought the danger had passed, she heard a chilling voice say, "I see you." Her heart sank even further. She looked up, and to her horror, she saw a face peering at her from the stall next to hers. The man had unkempt hair, and his eyes were bloodshot. Terrified, she screamed as loud as she could. The man tried to grab her, but her scream must have alerted someone else in the building. She heard loud banging sounds coming from outside the stall, and after what felt like an eternity, someone knocked on her stall door, telling her it was safe to come out. At first, she was hesitant, but when she heard her homeroom teacher's familiar voice, she finally unlocked the door and ran into her teacher's arms. Later, she found out that the intruder was a homeless man who had wandered into the school under the influence of drugs. Thankfully, no one was physically hurt, but the experience left my friend deeply shaken. Since that day, she's been too scared to use a bathroom alone and always makes sure she has someone with her. Near my house, there's a small forest that always seemed unassuming. I'd only ever been close to it with the kids from my block. Back then, there was a tale that surrounded the place, a story that gave us all the creeps. If you know, if you see, don't go too far, for if you do, the man made of wood will get you. He is born from the trees, with eyes full of greed. If you spot him late at night, run, run, run. It was a spooky story, but I didn't pay much attention to it. I was a good kid, and if you knew me back then, you'd know I was different from the other boys in my town. I had light blonde curly hair, didn't care much for sports, and preferred art, singing, and stories. I was kind and trustworthy, but also a bit gullible, which made me a target for teasing. This all started when I was 8. One day, a girl from my block and I were playing on her trampoline. We got bored, so we started telling each other scary stories. Little did I know, she had planned a prank on me with her older brother, whom I had never met before. He dressed up in a clown costume to scare me, as she told me a creepy story about her uncle, who she claimed had gone to prison for something terrible. Her brother suddenly appeared from a small alley next to the trampoline, holding a butter knife. Back then, I thought it was a real knife, so I panicked and ran. He chased after me, pretending to go after his sister as well. When I hid behind a wall and peeked out, I saw him standing over her with what looked like blood all over her shirt. I later found out it was just fake blood. Then he looked up and chased after me again. I ran and hid behind a building, only to see an opening in the fence that led into the forest. I crawled through the fence and ran deeper into the woods, hiding behind a bush and listening for any sign of him. I heard him run past and peek into the forest, then take off to find me elsewhere. I looked around and decided to venture further into the forest, my first time going in that deep. Eventually, I came to a clearing with tree stumps arranged like seats around an old fire pit. I sat down on one of the stumps, trying to catch my breath and figure out what had just happened. Suddenly, I heard footsteps approaching, and I dove behind a bush to hide. I watched as the girl's brother passed by, but when I turned around, I jumped in shock. Nestled in the bramble and bushes was a figure, a man, or at least it looked like one. He stood like a soldier at attention, smiling, with eyes that seemed both to stare directly at me and be completely hollow, as if his soul had been drained away. I stood up, terrified, and then I heard it, a whisper. At first, it was faint, but it grew louder. The whispers sounded like children, and then like a deep, manly voice. It said, "Hey there, looks like you're not having much fun." I was frozen with fear, not sure if they were talking to me, but the whispers continued, addressing me directly. Still scared, I managed to stammer out, "W, who's there?" The voice responded, "Oh, you're a boy? Well, that's just as good. Want to play a game?" I looked around, trying to find the source. "Who is it? Where are you?" "Why, I'm right in front of you," the voice said. But in front of me was the wooden man. I looked closer, and he had changed. His hands were now clenched, and his eyes were wider, with a wild, unsettling look. I was paralyzed with fear. "Well?" The voice rang out with a hint of playfulness. I whispered, "And no thanks." Suddenly, the wind picked up, and I heard the voice say, "Too bad." The wooden man began to shake, and then he took a step forward. That's when I realized he wasn't made of wood. He was a man. "Haven't you heard the tale?" he asked, walking closer. Fear surged through me, and I bolted out of the clearing, running as fast as I could. I found the girl and her brother sitting on the wooden stools, bored and waiting for me. When they saw me and then the man behind me, they froze. I immediately hid behind her brother, who raised his butter knife in defense. The man easily snatched it away and pushed him to the ground, smiling an unsettling smile. He reached out to grab me, but the girl and I sprinted toward the opening in the fence, her brother right behind us. As we passed the clearing, we looked back. The man had stopped and was standing still like a statue, but his eyes were still locked on us. We ran home as fast as we could and told our parents, who called the police. They searched the area, but all they found was the butter knife and a wooden statue of a man, standing at attention like a soldier. You might think this story ends there, but it doesn't. When I was 15, I had almost forgotten what happened. One day, I went back into the forest with one of my close friends. We walked to the spot where the wooden stools were. I sat on one of the stools while my friend went off to take care of something. Suddenly, I heard him scream and saw him rushing back into the clearing. Behind him was a dark figure, moving closer with purpose. It was him. I recognized him immediately. We didn't wait to find out what would happen next. We ran out of the forest as fast as we could. When we got back, the memories flooded back, and we told the police again. But just like before, they found nothing. Now, I can't help but fear that one day, he won't stop at the fence. The next time someone crosses his path, they might not be so lucky.
10 years ago today, my stepdad passed away. We were never entirely sure if it was due to foul play, an accident, or something else. He and my mom had been together for 7 years. Although they were never married, I always thought of him as a father. Even after they split up, he still managed to come to my graduation party, the last time I saw him in 2007. He traveled all the way from Florida to Michigan for it. He and my mom continued to talk on the phone regularly and remained friends. In 2008, we went on vacation to Mexico for about a week. When we returned home, it was the middle of a snowstorm. We unpacked and settled back in, and I remember feeling glad to be home. The next day, my brother and a couple of friends were over, and we were hanging out playing video games. Our landline rang, so I picked up the phone to hear my stepdad's best friend on the other end. At first, I thought it was a little strange, but I didn't think much of it. He didn't even say hello. Instead, he just said, "Nate's gone." I'll never forget that phone call, and I'll never know why he had to leave so soon, or what really happened. Fast forward to last month. I had just texted my brother to see how he was doing. I asked him if he'd ever had any dreams about eating meat, because I was trying out a vegan diet for a month and kept having dreams about it. He's been vegan for a while. He replied with something unexpected. "No, but I did have a very vivid dream about Nate. It was a great dream. I was really confused when I saw him because it wasn't like a memory from the past. I think I remember seeing him at a restaurant or a diner. I walked up to him and said, 'Is that really you, Nate?' He laughed and said, 'Who else would it be?' I started to cry and gave him a hug. That's when he told us that he wasn't really gone, that his spirit lives on. He laughed warmly and told us everything was going to be all right and not to worry about anything. After that, we all hung out for a little while playing cards, probably euchre. You, me, Nate, and Leaf. I know it's not a scary story, but it sent chills through my body in a good way. Felt like I finally got a bit of closure. I'd consider this situation unlikely because I'm a 6 feet 7 inches, 260-pound teenager. So I don't exactly see myself as an easy target for any kind of stranger. Still, given my size, I tend to be pretty casual about doing things at night. But looking back, I realized that shoveling snow after dark with headphones on is a terrible idea. It all started 3 years ago when I was walking home from a friend's place about a mile away. It was around 11 p.m., and the streets were mostly empty. I noticed I was walking about 35 feet behind someone but didn't really pay attention to him until he suddenly turned and walked up my front steps. Then he pulled out his phone and took a photo of my house using flash for some reason. He turned just enough that I could see his face clearly. Needless to say, I hurried inside and counted the hours until daylight. I had almost forgotten about that weird incident until, a week later, I was finishing up clearing my bottom steps. My house has 2 sets of stairs, one near the sidewalk with a 15-foot walkway, and another leading up to my porch. It was dark, and the street was empty when a man suddenly appeared and grabbed my shoulder, startling me. I wasn't exactly scared, though, just surprised. His face seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it. In a strangely upbeat tone, he asked, "Hey, got a cigarette?" I told him no, and he walked away. To keep this story short, I'll summarize the next few years. The same man approached me the following winter while I was shoveling at night and asked the same question in the same tone. I responded the same way and he left. This time, though, I remembered where I'd seen him before, and it started to creep me out. Still, I wasn't entirely freaked out. Oddly enough, I didn't see this man at all between our first and second encounters. 6 months ago, I figured that I'd only see this man during winter and that he wasn't a threat. Chalk it up to my big guy confidence. But then something happened that truly shook me. I have insomnia, so I was up at 3 a.m., pacing around. I glanced out my second-floor bedroom window, which faces the road. I did a double take, then walked back to the window to make sure I wasn't seeing things. The man was standing on the other side of the street, directly across from my house, just staring and pacing like he was waiting for something. After a few seconds, I turned on my room light. His head snapped up, and he looked straight at me before quickly turning and walking down the road. That winter, shoveling became a nerve-wracking task. I never did it at night again, and I found myself jumping at every little sound. I even dropped my shovel several times while clearing my front walk, just from being so on edge. I'm sure it looked ridiculous, but the fear was very real. Then, a couple of weeks ago, it happened again. Where I live, the sun sets around 5 p.m. in winter, and for some reason, my mom insisted I shovel right after work around 6:30 p.m., even though it was already dark. I complied but made sure not to listen to music and stayed very alert. Several times, I spun around, mistaking some passing college students. I live near a campus. For him. Now we get to why the layout of my front walk matters. I was just finishing up the steps closest to my house when he suddenly clamped down on my shoulder. I whipped around to look him in the eye, but he wasn't startled. He just calmly repeated his usual phrase, "Hey, got a cigarette?" Once again, I said no. I'm not sure why I can't bring myself to say anything else. He walked down my steps and continued on his way. My heart was racing as I rushed inside. I haven't seen him since, and I hope I never do again, especially since I'm heading to college before next winter. But I can't shake the feeling that our encounters aren't over. So, if anyone made it through reading all this, I'm looking for advice. Should I be worried? The main reason I'm concerned is because my house has code locks, and I'm worried he might have seen the code. Am I overreacting?
Every place has its own peculiar traditions, rituals that seem normal to locals but utterly bizarre to outsiders. My village, Everwood, always has a way of standing out whenever people from neighboring areas gather to share tales. The trump card in our stories is the mysterious siren that blares every 20 years. No one ever explicitly told us to keep it a secret, but it was an unspoken rule that this stayed within our tight-knit community. But it's too intriguing a tale to keep hidden. I was only about 3 years old when I first experienced it. I remember the village's frantic energy as we all crowded into an underground shelter. Despite the thick walls, we could still hear the faint wailing of the sirens echoing through the town. As I grew up, I noticed these strange poles scattered around the village. Tall structures with cone-shaped tops pointing in various directions. There were no visible wires or access points for maintenance, yet they always functioned perfectly when needed. There was no official department in charge of them. No one knew what they were connected to. They just existed, and that was that. Theories about their purpose were all over the place, but no one agreed on a single explanation. Over the years, I'd occasionally bring it up with others, and the opinions were wildly different. When I started high school, I'd walk to school every day. Driving wasn't common in Everwood, too small a place to need it. Most kids followed the same routes, and by the time we reached my house, the group usually had 4 or 5 of us. Our route was mostly consistent, but in winter, we'd sometimes take narrow alleys for shelter from the wind. One of those paths took us by the Chapel of Many. This wasn't a grand cathedral, but more like a gathering hall where middle-aged men would meet for a few drinks. Daytime drinking usually raises eyebrows, but they always claimed it was for religious reasons, and somehow that worked. We'd occasionally peek through the windows out of curiosity, though we knew little about what went on inside. However, everyone knew that the whole organization revolved around the siren that blared every 2 decades. They held events all over the village, giving the impression of a community center more than a religious institution. Still, if you ever questioned their casual approach to worship, they'd argue fiercely, even demanding thanks for supposedly protecting the village whenever the siren sounded. Their claim was impossible to prove, but it was just as impossible to disprove. Honestly, people would forget about it most of the time. Something that only happens every 20 years doesn't exactly feel urgent. But now and then, someone at school would bring it up, sparking new theories and jokes. But then there was Isaac. Whenever the siren was mentioned, Isaac would insist it was all a hoax. Everwood isn't fully on the grid. The government knows about us, but we've managed to maintain a degree of autonomy. Because of this, we still have a sort of ruling family, a lineage of the village founders who've passed down their influence through generations. This family claims to know the secret of the siren, but says it's kept hidden for our safety. It's a point of contention, but that's a story for another time. For the most part, they're well-liked, as they're very involved in the village's growth and development. But rumors persist. Isaac was convinced the siren was a tool for control. Every 20 years, it's used to assert authority, to remind us who's in charge. Anyone who doesn't seek shelter when the siren blares is never seen again. In my later school years, I met a girl named Clara. She was sweet, and in such a small village, meeting new people after a certain age was rare. People say everyone knows everyone in a small town, and they're not far off. We met during a school trip. She was a year below me, and this particular trip mixed a few different grades. By the end of it, we were inseparable, and that continued after we returned. I quickly got to know her family, and we all got along well. But one dinner conversation stood out to me. I casually mentioned that someone at school had been talking about the chapel of many being involved in some disorderly conduct again, ranting about the siren as if it was urgent. The mood at the table immediately shifted. Clara's parents fell silent, but Clara spoke up to break the tension. She had an older brother, Mark. Mark had heard a rumor about the siren that was still around. The idea that if you stayed outside when the siren blared, you'd meet the spirits of the village, and if your wish was strong enough, it would be granted. Mark had a wish, one he never shared with his family. When the evacuations began, Mark slipped away. Clara's family couldn't find him, but it was too late to search. They had to hope he was safe as the siren wailed. They searched for him afterward. The entire village joined in, but Mark was never found. Belief in something supernatural happening during the siren wasn't uncommon, but Clara's family had their own thoughts. They believed that Mark would never have wished to leave his family behind. So if he stayed out to make a wish and disappeared, the spirits couldn't be good. They must be evil, something to hide from. I once asked my dad about the sirens. He was a handyman, the go-to guy if you needed something fixed or built. He could figure out just about anything with enough time. He wasn't formally educated, but he wasn't stupid. In a place like Everwood, practical knowledge was more valued than formal qualifications. When I was younger, he told me a story. Every 20 years, a monster comes and devours anyone caught outside when the sirens sound. It was a common story to keep kids in check, passed down through generations. Even when I was in high school, he stuck to that story, adding more gruesome details to keep me from becoming complacent. Parents worried about the sirens catching teens out in the woods, drinking or wandering too far from home. There was no fixed date for the sirens, only the knowledge that it happened every 20 years, give or take a few days. People tried to predict the exact date, but nothing was ever accurate. So as the expected time approached, everyone became extra cautious. I was almost 23 and a few years into my career when the time for the next siren drew near. By village standards, I was considered an adult. So I decided to ask my dad again what he really thought the siren was. He stuck to his story. It was a monster. I expected the same old tale, but this time he added more detail. He mentioned strange marks on doors where pets were left outside, and giant footprints found at the village's edge. He said that people who brought these things up were often laughed at, but a small group was deeply invested in the idea. Then he mentioned the rumors about wishes. He believed that the ruling family knew the truth and spread the rumors themselves. Stories of wishes, power, and new life, all designed to lure people outside during the ominous event. When I asked him why they would do such a thing, his answer was simple. Every 20 years, It gets hungry. I mentioned the Chapel of Many's gatherings earlier. As the year of the siren approaches, they ramp up their efforts. The family-friendly events either taper off or are used to recruit new members. It's like a cliché timeshare sales pitch. I was planning a special day out with my girlfriend, Wendy. Though we went to the same school, we met a few years later. Things were going well, so I wanted to treat her to something special. Our usual fancy night out was at a steakhouse with an evening menu that felt like a luxury in our small town. The owner was known for making special occasions memorable, but he had a strict rule: no lying about your birthday or anniversary just to get special treatment. Word traveled fast in Everwood, and a lie could tarnish your reputation for years. This time, though, I noticed a poster about a pop-up restaurant offering foreign cuisine and entertainment. In Everwood, trying something like Chinese food was a rare luxury, so the idea of tasting something completely foreign was exciting. When I saw a Vietnamese diner was coming to town, I immediately signed us up. Not many people got in, but I managed to secure a spot by mentioning our special day. It was the talk of the town, and I found out that many people my age were going. Even though I wanted this to be about Wendy and me, I invited my parents, but they refused. Wendy's parents did the same. Looking back, that should have been a red flag. The day came, and there was a tension in the air. We were seated in a small auditorium, tables arranged so everyone could see the stage. We expected some kind of performance, and we were eager for it. The lights dimmed, and a spotlight shone on the stage. A man with an unfamiliar complexion, distinct eyes, and jet black hair was introduced as the head chef. But then he was joined by two members of the Chapel of Many, and we realized what we'd gotten into. The chef looked displeased as the church members introduced the evening's program. As the night went on, the air was filled with propaganda instead of the exotic scents we had hoped for. The church members took turns on stage, highlighting their contributions to the village, from community events to fundraisers. They painted a picture of themselves as the village's saviors, the ones who kept Everwood thriving. They appealed to everyone in the room, from families to couples like us, and it became clear this was a recruitment event. The cuisine was secondary to their cause. Wendy whispered to me, "I thought we were here to eat, not to be converted." She looked annoyed, and I couldn't blame her. We were all ready to leave when the chef took the stage again. He was given the mic to discuss his culinary journey, but his enthusiasm seemed to have vanished. The propaganda had dampened his spirits, and it showed. Dinner was finally served, but it felt like an afterthought. The food was decent, but the atmosphere was ruined. The chef had tried to create something special, but the church's agenda overshadowed it. After the event, Wendy and I walked home in silence, both feeling like our special night had been hijacked. It was a lesson learned: beware of too good to be true events in Everwood. When the day of the siren finally arrived, I stayed inside with my parents. We were among the last to make it to the shelter, something I was secretly proud of. Not because I was late, but because it was a good cover for sneaking out later. We spent hours down there, but it felt like days. The shelter was a grim place, with stale air and dim lighting. But it was tradition, and tradition ruled in Everwood. When the siren sounded, it wasn't a distant wail like I remembered from my childhood. It was deafening, an all-consuming sound that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. I watched the other villagers as they huddled together, some praying, others staring blankly at the walls. The reality of what was happening was sinking in, and for a moment, I felt a pang of fear. But then I remembered why I was there. I needed to know what was outside. When the siren finally died down, my parents were among the first to leave the shelter. I hesitated, waiting for the right moment. When their backs were turned, I slipped out and made my way to the village square. The streets were deserted, and an eerie silence hung in the air. The village that had been bustling just hours before now felt like a ghost town. I walked through the square, my footsteps echoing off the stone buildings. As I approached the Chapel of Many, I noticed something strange. The chapel doors were wide open, and the lights inside were flickering. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and then I saw them. The men from the chapel were gathered in a circle, their heads bowed in prayer. But this wasn't the casual, almost joking prayer I had seen before. this was something else. Their voices were low and urgent, their words foreign and harsh. I hid behind a nearby building, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The men were chanting in a language I didn't recognize, and the air around them seemed to shimmer. And then I saw it. A figure, dark and indistinct, emerged from the center of the circle. It was tall, almost reaching the ceiling, and its presence seemed to suck the light out of the room. The men continued to chant, their voices rising in intensity. The figure moved closer to them, and as it did, I felt a wave of cold wash over me. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but I couldn't move. My feet were fixed to the ground, and all I could do was look in horror as the figure reached out towards the men. Suddenly, the chanting stopped. The figure paused, its hand inches away from one of the men's heads. There was a moment of silence, and then the figure vanished. The men stood there, stunned, as if they couldn't believe what had just happened. Then, slowly, they began to leave the chapel one by one, without saying a word. I waited until the last of them had gone before I dared to move. My heart was still pounding, but I forced myself to walk into the chapel. The air was cold, and the light was still flickering. I looked around, but there was no sign of the figure or the men. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed, I heard a voice behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I turned around to see one of the older villagers, a man I had known my entire life. He looked at me with a mix of fear and pity. "Go home," he said, "and forget what you saw." I wished to ask him what was going on. The look in his eyes told me that I'd not get an answer, so I left the chapel, my mind racing with questions. I never told anyone what I saw that night. I tried to forget it, but the memory lingered, a dark shadow over my thoughts. Years later, when the siren sounded again, I was long gone from Everwood. I still remember that night, and the feeling that something far more sinister was at work in the village. I've heard the sirens call twice in my life, and twice I've lived to tell the tale. But I've come to realize that the siren isn't just a warning. It's a reminder that in Everwood, some secrets are better left buried. The story of the Everwood siren is one that will stay with me forever. Not long ago, I embarked on a road trip to attend a small family reunion aimed at bringing our scattered relatives closer together. Living quite a distance from them meant I had a lengthy journey ahead. After driving for an entire day and making several stops at gas stations, fatigue started to set in. Knowing the dangers of driving while tired, I decided it was best to find a place to rest for the night. I pulled into a seemingly ordinary motel that didn't appear too busy. Just a few workers and a couple were present. Despite some unsettling experiences in my past, motels had never particularly scared me. I always thought the horror stories were confined to movies and not real life. However, I couldn't shake off a slight feeling of unease as I checked in. At the front desk, I booked a room and carried my bags inside, reminding myself that it was just for one night. The room was cozy with comforting, warm lighting that helped me relax. I fell asleep without any issues, but around 2 a.m., I abruptly woke up with an inexplicable sense of discomfort. Hoping to calm my nerves, I decided to get up and have something to drink. There was a coffee and tea maker in the room along with a cup, so I made myself some warm tea since I'm not much of a coffee drinker. After finishing the tea, I tried to go back to sleep. Just about 5 minutes after closing my eyes, the phone in the room, the one used to call the front desk, started ringing. Although I knew it might be best not to answer, curiosity and a bit of fear got the better of me. I picked up the phone only to hear a faint buzzing sound, similar to the noise a television makes when its signal is cutting out and producing that glitchy static. Feeling unsettled, I hurried to the reception area and opened the door, only to find it completely empty. Neither the receptionist nor any of the workers were there. The only sounds were the same faint buzz and the soft playing of classical music from a radio in the back room. Considering this was a recent event and not something from decades past, the presence of an old-fashioned music-playing radio struck me as odd, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a prank call, and the staff had stepped away or were sleeping. This thought offered me a bit of comfort. As I turned around to head back to my room, I was startled by the sudden appearance of a man standing behind me. He was tall, definitely over 6 feet. He asked, "What do you need?" I explained the strange phone call, and he replied that it was a regular occurrence that only happened to those who deserved it. Deserved what? I didn't dare to ask and didn't want the conversation to continue any longer than necessary. I walked back to my room, hoping to get some rest. Throughout the remainder of the night, the phone kept ringing incessantly. Unable to ignore it any longer, I got up again and stepped outside, only to notice the same tall man standing outside my window with his back turned toward it. I mustered the courage to ask, "What are you doing?" He simply replied that he wanted some fresh air. I decided to get a drink from the vending machines to calm my nerves. When I returned, the man was gone, but to my shock, my room door was wide open. Feeling exhausted and overwhelmed, I chose to ignore this disturbing fact. I went inside, closed and locked the door, and got into bed. Perhaps not the smartest decision, but fatigue outweighed my concern at that moment. An hour later, I was jolted awake by the sound of knocking. Not just on my front door, but also on the bathroom door inside my room. Oddly, my front door was unlocked despite me securing it earlier. In a panic, I dashed toward the door, hoping that if someone was outside, I could knock them over and make a run for the front desk. Once there, I found the receptionist present this time. I frantically recounted everything that had happened, but he looked at me as if I were out of my mind. I mentioned the strange phone calls, and he insisted that such things never occurred and that whoever had told me otherwise did not work there. We both went back to my room, but the mysterious man was nowhere to be found. There was no evidence of his presence at all. Despite the receptionist's skepticism, I know what I experienced was real. To this day, I have never seen that man again.
It was a cold winter night in New York City, and I was holed up in my room, reviewing a script for an audition the next morning. As an aspiring actor, every opportunity was crucial, so I needed to be prepared. I lived alone in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building in Harlem. The neighborhood was usually quiet, but there were always strange stories floating around about things that happened at night. The usual city sounds, distant traffic and the occasional siren, filled the background, but that night, something unsettling was about to happen. I was completely focused on the script, the soft rustle of the pages the only sound in my room. Suddenly, another noise broke the silence. Heavy footsteps climbing the stairs. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a neighbor coming home late. But then the footsteps stopped right outside my door, sending a chill down my spine. I called out, thinking it might be a friend who sometimes dropped by unannounced. "Jake, is that you?" I asked, hoping for a familiar voice in return. But the only response was silence. Nervousness started to creep in, but I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just someone passing by. However, as I approached the door, I heard hurried footsteps descending the stairs, as if someone was fleeing. My heart began to race. I backed away from the door, realizing that whoever had been there wasn't my friend. Fear started to take hold, and I considered calling the police, but what could I say? That someone ran down the stairs? I decided to let it go, making sure to lock the door with every bolt. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I told a few friends and family members about it, but they all dismissed it, saying it was probably just a neighbor in a rush. Still, the unease lingered. I began hearing odd noises at night, faint taps like someone trying to get in, but whenever I checked, there was no one there. A week later, I decided it was time to move. I found a new apartment in another part of the city and started packing. The night before the move, as I was finishing up, I heard the same footsteps on the stairs. This time, they were slower, as if someone was deliberately approaching. Once again, the footsteps stopped outside my door. I didn't call out this time. I knew whoever it was didn't belong. I stayed silent, hoping they would leave. But then something terrifying happened. The door, which I had locked, started shaking violently. as if someone was trying to force it open. Panicked, I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the sharpest knife I could find. I was trembling, fear gripping me tightly. The banging on the door grew louder, and I was sure it was about to give way. Then suddenly, everything stopped. The silence that followed was almost more frightening than the noise. I stood there, breathless and shaking. After a few minutes, I gathered the courage to look through the peephole, but no one was there. The next day, I left the apartment as quickly as I could, not looking back. I moved into the new place, trying to forget what had happened. But the story didn't end there. A few days later, I heard some disturbing news. A body had been found in the basement of my old building, wrapped in plastic. The victim was a woman who had been missing for weeks. The discovery made me wonder if the incident I experienced was connected to the crime. Had the killer been using the building as a hideout? Had I been watched by someone with bad intentions? I tried to push these thoughts aside, but they kept haunting me. I realized that if I had gone down the stairs that night, it might have been me instead of that woman. Months passed, and I started to feel safe again. But one night, in my new apartment, while I was lying in bed, I heard that familiar sound. Footsteps slowly making their way up the stairs. The fear came rushing back. Whatever or whoever it was, it seemed to have found me again. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, just like before. I couldn't move, just waited, frozen in place. Then, with a loud click, the lights in my apartment went out. Panic set in, and I scrambled to grab the knife again. When I turned on the light with my phone, I saw something terrifying. The door was open, as if someone had come inside. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. The hallway was dark, and I felt as if something was there, watching me. Without a second thought, I bolted out of the apartment, running down the stairs as fast as I could. I never went back. I left New York City, moving to a small town in the countryside, hoping to find peace. But what I didn't realize was that, no matter where I went, the footsteps would follow me. Because, for whatever was chasing me, the hunt wasn't over yet. It was a warm summer day, and my brother, sister, and I decided to visit the park with our two best friends. The park was nearby, nestled in an isolated area surrounded by woods. Parents usually sat at picnic tables not far from the playground, keeping an eye on their kids as they played. We met up with our friends and spent some time on the playground before joining a game of tag with the other kids. While everyone else was still on the playground, my friend and I decided to explore the woods. We didn't ask our parents for permission, thinking it would be fine. As we wandered deeper into the forest, we came across a stream. Being science enthusiasts who loved rocks and minerals, we started searching for interesting stones. As we continued exploring, we suddenly heard the sound of leaves crunching, as if someone or something was walking nearby. We looked around, thinking it was just an animal, but we didn't see anything. Shrugging it off, we kept going. But the farther we ventured into the woods, the more uneasy I felt, like someone was watching us. I suggested we head back to the playground, and my friend agreed, realizing our parents might start to worry if we stayed away too long. We made our way back and resumed playing on the swings. While we were swinging, we noticed a little boy wandering off into the woods by himself. We also spotted a car parked on the other side of the woods, and soon after, a man emerged from behind a tree, approaching the boy. It looked like he was trying to lure the boy toward him. The boy began to follow, and the man reached out, trying to grab him. But just then, the boy's parents noticed and called him back. The man quickly fled into the woods and sped away in his car. Fortunately, one of the parents managed to snap a picture of him. My friend and I were shaken, realizing that we had been in the same spot where the man was hiding. He could have been watching us the whole time, or worse, tried to take one of us. We were incredibly grateful that the little boy was safe, thanks to his parents' quick reaction. After that, our families decided it was best to go home, and we all agreed never to return to that park again. This happened to me a few years ago, and the memory still haunts me. One night, as I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, my black cat, Luna, scratched at my bedroom door, wanting to be let out. Tired but still somewhat awake, I got out of bed, shuffled to the door, and let her out. However, instead of heading off on her own, she led me to the side door, wanting to go outside. I opened the door and pushed the screen door aside so she could leave. After closing the screen door, I glanced across the way towards my neighbor's house, which was partially blocked by my dad's 1995 Chevy truck parked in the driveway. It was then that I saw something strange standing near the hood of the truck. I could only see its shoulders and up, but what I saw was deeply unsettling. The figure had a head that seemed too large for its thin, bony neck and shoulders. Where its eyes should have been, there were only two pitch-black voids against pale, almost translucent skin. The rest of its face was even more disturbing. The upper part looked like it was covered in tight, smooth skin, but as it got closer to the jaw, the flesh appeared torn and shredded. The jaw was exposed bone, and it had a wide, eerie grin that seemed to be directed right at me. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I wear glasses to see at a distance, so I squinted, trying to make out what I was seeing. But that only made things worse. The details of the figure became clearer. I could see the texture of its skin, the wrinkles, and the torn flesh in shocking detail. There was no mistaking it now. Terrified, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. Even as I tried to convince myself that it wasn't real, I couldn't shake the fear that gripped me. I knew what I saw. Still shaken, I ran back to my room and jumped into bed. Even though I was in my 30s, I pulled the blankets over my head, trying to hide from the fear that overwhelmed me, just like I used to do as a child when I had nightmares. I felt completely vulnerable, even though my parents were just in the next room. As I hid under the covers, I suddenly heard a long, continuous scratching sound on the wall where I had seen the creature. It was as if something was dragging its nails across the bumpy surface of my bedroom wall, lightly tapping each bump as it went. My panic grew, and I felt as though I was reliving the terror of my childhood nightmares. I started to cry, trying to calm myself down and convince myself that I was safe. Maybe whatever it was fed on fear, I thought, and was enjoying the terror it was causing me. As I started to calm down, the scratching finally stopped, and the room fell silent. Despite everything I had experienced, I kept trying to tell myself that it wasn't real. The next night, Luna wanted to go outside again. Reluctantly, I looked toward the spot where I had seen the creature the night before, behind the hood of my dad's truck. But this time, there was nothing there. Nothing in the area resembled the figure I had seen. That's when it hit me. I hadn't imagined it. What I saw was real, and that realization scared me even more. I never want to see that thing again, and I hope it never comes back. I'm a man who lives in Prior Lake, Minnesota, and I've called this place home for many years. I moved here to escape the constant worries of break-ins and robberies that plagued my old neighborhood. Life in Prior Lake had been peaceful until one unsettling night. Started like any other evening. I was up late, playing video games like War Thunder and Destiny 2 on my Xbox, chatting with my friends online. We were deep into a session, lost in the virtual world, when my friend Owen, who was also playing, suddenly said he saw someone outside my house. Owen was known for being a bit jumpy, always on edge, so I didn't think much of it at first. I figured he was just overreacting, as he tended to do. We went back to our game, engaging in a quick tank battle in War Thunder. But then Owen mentioned the stranger again, insisting I take a look. This time I did, and what I saw sent chills down my spine. Standing outside, just beyond the glow of my porch light, was a man. He wore a black hoodie, his face twisted into a wide, unsettling smile, and in his hand, he held a large knife. Panic set in immediately. I shut off the Xbox and hurriedly told my friends to head upstairs with me. We raced to my room, hearts pounding, trying to figure out what to do next. Just as we were catching our breath, we heard something that made our blood run cold. The front door creaked open, followed by a low, maniacal laugh. In that moment, terror took over, but not for Xander, the bravest of our group. He decided he would confront the intruder. I watched from the loft above as Xander, with more courage than I could muster, charged down the stairs. He met the man in the hallway and, with surprising force, knocked him out cold. Without hesitation, Xander dragged the unconscious intruder out of the house and locked the door behind him. Then he quickly called the police. The police arrived swiftly, much to our relief. They found the man still lying on my porch, and after securing him in handcuffs, they loaded him into the back of a squad car and drove him away. I'm incredibly grateful that Xander was there that night, brave enough to face the danger head-on. Thanks to him, the intruder was apprehended before he could do any harm. I can only hope that this terrifying encounter was a one-time ordeal, and that I'll never have to face something like this again.
Day 1. Lately, I've been noticing something unsettling. Children have been disappearing without a trace, and it's happening overnight. At first, I thought it might just be a coincidence, but the more I think about it, the less I believe that. There has to be something behind these disappearances. It's too consistent to be random. I can't just assume they got lost. There's something more sinister at play here, but I don't know where to start looking for clues. Still, I have to try. There's no one else who seems to be investigating. I'll make note of anything I find in the coming days. Day 2. Today, I came across a report from parents whose child vanished at the park. It's strange because that park is typically deserted around 7:30 in the evening, and with school in session, the kids aren't usually around at that time. This suggests that the disappearances must be happening either in the very early hours of the morning or later in the afternoon. I'll need to start observing the park more closely and gather more details. It might take several days, but I'm determined to identify any patterns. Day 12. After days of observation, I think I've finally found a pattern. The disappearances seem to occur in the afternoon, particularly around 4 p.m. That's the time when parents begin looking for their children, only to find them gone without a trace. This could be the breakthrough I've been searching for. I feel like I'm getting closer to solving this mystery, and with it, the chance to save these children before it's too late. Day 17. I've hit a roadblock. Despite identifying the time of the disappearances, I still can't figure out who or what is behind them. The theory I had doesn't seem to hold up under closer scrutiny. I've clearly missed something, and it's back to the drawing board for me. I need to dig deeper. There's so much more to uncover. Day 24. Something strange happened today. I heard about several people who ventured into certain locations, hospitals and forests, and came back deeply disturbed, their minds fractured by whatever they encountered. I've searched those areas myself but found nothing unusual. What did they see that I missed? I need to talk to them, find out exactly what they experienced. Ever since I started this investigation, I've had the eerie feeling of being watched, especially when I'm at the park. Every time I try to investigate, I'm paralyzed by a sudden, overwhelming fear. It's as if something doesn't want me to uncover the truth. Day 31. Today, I finally managed to speak with some of the people who returned disturbed from those locations. What they described wasn't human, at least not in the way we understand it. This revelation terrifies me, but it also pushes me forward. I'm so close to uncovering the truth behind these disappearances, but I need more information. I need to know what this creature looks like, but how can I find out? I feel like I'm waiting for a sign, a clue, something to push me in the right direction. I'm on the edge of solving this mystery, and I can't stop now. Day 35. Another person has been affected, and this time they described what they saw in detail. They spoke of a figure, human-like but unnaturally tall, with no face, just a smooth surface where its features should be. This description sent chills down my spine, but it was the missing piece I needed. I asked them to draw what they saw, and when they handed me the sketch, everything clicked into place. The details matched perfectly with everything I'd discovered so far. I finally know what's been taking the children, but knowing is only the beginning. The real challenge will be stopping it. I don't know how or if I even can, but I have to try. The safety of the remaining children depends on it. I'm more determined than ever to see this through to the end, no matter the cost. The creature's identity is no longer a mystery. It's a threat that needs to be confronted before it strikes again. I'll never forget the night that became the most terrifying experience of my life. It was between 9 and 10 p.m. on Thursday, July 9th, 2020, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. I was living in Pittsburgh at the time. Around 9 p.m., I started a load of laundry, knowing it would take about 20 to 30 minutes to finish. With some time to kill, I decided to go for a walk around my neighborhood, hoping the fresh night air would clear my mind. I put in my earbuds, listening to the song Same Old Story by a band I liked on repeat. To give you some context, I was feeling pretty low that night. The pandemic had put the world on hold. Everything was closed, and life as I knew it had come to a standstill. I had recently been caught in a downtown protest that turned into a chaotic scene, and there was a scandal at the university I attended. On top of all that, I was struggling with isolation, unable to see friends or even visit the spots I loved in Pittsburgh's nightlife, especially on the South Side. Being an upbeat person by nature, I found it hard to cope with the sudden change. Overthinking had always been my weakness, and this time it brought a level of emotional distress that was overwhelming. As I made my way back home, just 15 minutes before 10 p.m., I was walking along a small highway that had no streetlights, only the eerie darkness and the sound of crickets chirping from the woods on either side. It felt creepy, but I kept moving forward, lost in my thoughts. About half a mile from home, I was walking on the right side of the road when a white car approached from the opposite direction. The car slowed down as it neared me, and the driver's window rolled down. A man inside yelled at me to drop my wallet. At first, I was stunned, unsure why he was making such a demand. But as I stepped closer, I noticed he was pointing something at me. A gun. My heart sank. I didn't have my wallet with me, but that hardly mattered. Panic surged through me as I realized the seriousness of the situation. Without thinking, I turned and sprinted towards my house, terrified that he might shoot or turn the car around to chase me. I was wearing a white sleeveless shirt, long jeans, and waterproof boots, but none of that slowed me down. I kept glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, dreading the sight of that white car following me, but it never did. When I finally reached home, I was drenched in sweat, my mind racing with the realization of what had just happened. My heart was pounding as I reflected on how close I had come to real danger. The only other person at home was my second cousin, who was in the gaming room, completely oblivious to my terrifying ordeal. My mother and my cousin, his mom, were out of town that night, so they had no idea what I had just gone through. Never in my life had I imagined that I could become the target of an attempted robbery. In hindsight, I wish I had noted the car's make, model, or at least the license plate to report to the authorities. But in the heat of the moment, all I could think about was escaping. The fear and shock of the experience clouded my judgment. I should have called the police right away, but I didn't. I was young, overwhelmed by the pandemic, and had never filed a police report before. I felt ashamed and selfish for not taking action. Even now, I regret not dialing 911, but the thought of my overprotective mother, who wasn't home that night, knowing what had happened, held me back. I didn't want her to live with the fear that her youngest son's life had been threatened. To this day, only a few close friends know what really happened that night. I've kept it a secret from my family, hoping to spare them the worry. Looking back, I realize how reckless it was to go out for a walk alone at night, especially during such an uncertain time. My mind wasn't in the right place due to the stress of the pandemic, and I needed that walk to clear my head. But the experience taught me a valuable lesson. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, don't take unnecessary risks. Don't go out alone at night, especially in dark or isolated areas. Always be aware of your surroundings and stay safe. Whether it's during a pandemic or any other time, your safety should always come first. I often wonder what could have happened if I hadn't figured out the situation as quickly as I did, or if I had told the man I didn't have my wallet. If I hadn't reacted the way I did, there's a very real chance I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Several years ago, I worked the night shift at a hotel in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. During the tourist season, the job wasn't too bad, mostly families and vacationers, and we had on-site security. But the off-season, particularly the winter months, was a different story. The hotel offered cheap weekly rates, which attracted some unsavory characters. The idea was to bring in snowbirds, retired folks who wanted to escape the harsh northern winters, but it didn't always work out that way. Instead, the low rates sometimes brought in long-term residents who were far less desirable. I found myself dealing with more than my fair share of problems. Disruptive guests, the occasional meth lab, and even physical altercations. Working the third shift, I encountered all sorts of people. The cold weather often led homeless individuals to seek shelter in the lobby, where they'd grab a cup of the free coffee. Technically, I wasn't supposed to let them stay, but I couldn't bring myself to turn them away as long as they didn't cause any trouble. Night shifts during the winter months were unpredictable, and I've got plenty of stories, but this one stands out because of how badly it ended for me. That night had started off well. Before heading to work, I had gone to an indie wrestling show with my best friend. I was really excited because I had arranged to come in an hour late for my shift that night, thanks to a favor I did for a coworker earlier. At the wrestling event, I even met Terry Blaze, a wrestling legend known for his intense and often brutal matches. Little did I know that I was about to experience something similarly violent in real life. I was supposed to start my shift at midnight that night, later than my usual 11 p.m. start. After I arrived, I counted the cash register and got the usual briefing from the second shift worker about what had happened earlier. Just as she was leaving, my friend, whom we'll call Mark, pulled up. Mark worked as a maintenance guy across all 3 hotels owned by our company. He often stopped by after his shift to grab food and hang out. We'd usually eat and play World of Warcraft on our laptops since the nights were often quiet. That evening, Mark was just getting my order for food, and I was still buzzing about the wrestling show, proudly showing off my Terry Blaze t-shirt. As I was about to head to the back office to put my shirt away, I heard the doorbell chime, signaling that someone had entered the lobby. There's a saying about bells tolling, and I didn't realize at that moment how true it was. I turned around when I heard someone shout something, though I couldn't make out the words. I had just reached the doorway when I saw Mark suddenly collapse right in front of me. Before I could react, a man came around the corner and struck me in the head with a short steel pipe. The blow knocked me to one knee. I barely had time to register what was happening before he hit me again, this time even harder. I remember hearing a second voice, the other guy who I hadn't noticed until then, shouting that Mark had escaped and gone for help. The 2 attackers then fled out the door. I managed to get to my feet, disoriented and in pain. I tried to call the police from the back office phone, but it wasn't working properly. Frustrated and terrified, I slammed it down and locked the front door, afraid they might come back. I was also worried about Mark, not knowing where he had gone. I finally called 911, blood now streaming down my face, and told the operator that I had been attacked and needed both an officer and an ambulance. After that, I called the night manager at our other hotel, a guy named Travis. At first, he thought I was joking, as we often played pranks on each other when things were slow. But I managed to convince him that this time was no joke. He said he'd lock up and come down to help. The police and ambulance arrived shortly after, and that's when I found out what had happened to Mark. After being sucker punched and knocked down, he had managed to leap over the desk and flag down a passing police car for help. Meanwhile, I was taken to the hospital, where I ended up needing 10 staples in my scalp. The pain was intense, and they gave me morphine to help with it. With no way to get home afterward, the doctor and nurses kindly pooled some money to pay for a cab. Despite everything, I planned to go back to work. It was December, and with Christmas coming up, I needed all the hours I could get to support my 3 kids. When I returned to the hotel, Ted, the IT guy, and his wife Barbara, who also worked at the front desk, were there. They were shocked to see me back so soon, thinking I'd still be in the hospital. Ted had been pulling the security footage for the police, and what I saw on the tape was horrifying. I had thought I was hit once or twice after being punched, but the video showed that the guy had struck me 10 times with the pipe as I struggled to get up. I kept trying to grab the pipe and stand, but I must have been out on my feet. The only reason they stopped was that Mark had managed to escape and alert the cops. The hotel management gave me a week off to recover and moved me to the night shift at one of our other properties for a month, just in case the attackers were targeting me specifically. We never found out why they attacked me. The police suspected it was a failed strong-arm robbery, but they never caught the guys. A detective came by about 2 months later, showing me some mugshots to see if I could identify the attackers. 2 of the photos looked familiar, but I couldn't be 100% sure. When I told the detective I was about 85% certain, he snapped at me, asking if I wanted to send someone to jail for attempted murder based on 85% certainty. I was stunned into silence. Here I was, the victim of a brutal attack, being berated as if it were my fault that I couldn't positively identify them. Everything had happened so fast, and the video quality wasn't great either. After that incident, I was done with working night shifts at hotels. It was just too dangerous, especially in that area. I'm thankful I made it out alive, but that experience left a lasting impact on me.
These events took place when I was between the ages of 6 and 9. It all began when I was visiting my cousin, who was just a year older than me. Back then, she was quite adventurous, so one day we decided to explore a small forest near my school. It was around 1 p.m., and everything seemed perfectly normal. We didn't expect anything unusual to happen. While we were making our way through the woods, I slipped and fell as we climbed down a small hill. My cousin quickly came down to help me, but as soon as she reached me, something strange occurred. A large shadow suddenly leaped over us. We both saw and heard it clearly, and we promised each other that we weren't imagining things. We knew it couldn't have been an animal because the forest was too small and surrounded by the city. Frightened, we dashed out of the woods, our imaginations running wild as we tried to make sense of what had happened. A year later, we convinced ourselves that the shadow we had seen was just some animal. Once again, we decided to go on an adventure, this time to a different forest about 2 kilometers away from the first one. We were on a mission to find an old bunker from World War II that some of my friends had mentioned. Feeling bolder than before, we set out at around 6 p.m., even though it was already getting dark. We searched for the bunker for hours, but eventually we decided to split up to cover more ground. Even though I had been to this forest before, something felt different this time. The woods seemed unfamiliar, as if I was in a completely different place, far away from the city. Despite the sun not being fully set, I couldn't recognize any landmarks. I started to panic when my cousin didn't respond to my calls, and I ran in a random direction, hoping to find my way out. Finally, I spotted a rope swing tied to one of the trees, which I recognized as being near the edge of the forest. I followed the path until I heard my cousin shouting my name. I stopped and called back to her. She came running over a small hill, clearly relieved to see me. She told me she had been calling out for me too, but neither of us had heard the other. We were both puzzled but decided to head home without thinking too much about it. Nearly 2 years later, we found ourselves back in that same forest, reminiscing about our old adventures and determined to find the bunker once again. This time, we stuck together and, after some searching, finally located it. When we looked inside with our flashlight, we were horrified by what we saw. There were old, burned candles, a pentagram, and strange liquids scattered around. The sight made us uneasy, and we quickly left the area, worried that someone might show up. As we approached the familiar rope swing on our way out, we noticed it was swinging back and forth on its own. There was no one else around, so we quickened our pace, knowing we were close to my cousin's home. Just when we thought we were safe, we suddenly heard footsteps behind us. We turned around but saw nothing. The footsteps, however, kept getting closer until I felt something brush against my shoulder. The footsteps then seemed to pass us, though nothing was visible. I looked at my cousin, and she nodded, confirming that she had heard the footsteps too. We were terrified and ran straight to her house, where we told her mom what had happened. As expected, she didn't believe us, dismissing our story as just a product of our imaginations. I didn't tell anyone else about these experiences for years, and it wasn't until I was older that I began to connect these incidents. Now, looking back, I realized just how similar they all were. I was born in Ecuador and lived there until I was 5 years old. The house where I was born had a reputation for being haunted, partly because it was built on land that used to be a cemetery. To make matters worse, my second oldest sister, when she was a teenager, started experimenting with a Ouija board. She would sneak out around 3 a.m., often taking our Doberman with her, and visit the empty houses in our area. She didn't want anyone to know what she was doing, so she kept it secret. One of her favorite spots was under a lemon tree in our aunt's yard, especially since our aunt's house was usually empty due to frequent travel. Unfortunately, my sister may have opened doors that should have remained closed. Over the years, a lot of strange and unsettling things started happening, not just in our home, but in the houses around us as well. I could share more about those incidents another time. When I was 5, my parents, 2 of my siblings, and I moved to New York City, while my oldest sibling stayed behind in Ecuador. Our house there was abandoned for a few years after we left. When I was 11, I returned to Ecuador to visit family, and my siblings took me to see our old home. The house had no windows, and although Ecuador is usually quite hot, the inside of the house felt inexplicably cold, as if an air conditioner was running. While we were there, my siblings thought it would be funny to lock me in my sister's old room, the one who used the Ouija board. But as soon as I was locked in with her, I saw something that terrified me. Her face seemed to change right before my eyes. It transformed into the face of an old woman. I was so frightened that I started crying and screaming for my siblings to let me out. When they finally did, I was so scared that I was pale and couldn't stop crying. Since that day, whenever I visit Ecuador, I avoid staying with that sister. On my most recent trip to Ecuador, I stayed in the house next door to my childhood home, which now belongs to my older sister. That house has always had a heavy, negative energy. I couldn't sleep alone there. I always needed my niece to sleep beside me. On the last day of my visit, we were all hanging out by the pool in the backyard when I suddenly felt something touch me, even though no one was near. I decided to stay quiet, thinking it was nothing, until my sister mentioned that she had felt something touch her in the pool just moments after I did. Later, I took a picture of the pool, and someone on social media pointed out something strange: a face in the photo. When I looked closer, I noticed 2 more forms in the picture, and there was nothing nearby that could have caused those reflections. But that wasn't the only unsettling thing that happened that night. As I was lying in bed, watching TV with my niece asleep next to me, I kept feeling like something was staring at me. I tried to ignore it, but eventually, I couldn't take it anymore and turned to look. As soon as I did, I saw a tall, shadowy figure, hooded and dark, disappear right before my eyes. That experience still haunts me, and I've learned to trust my instincts when I feel something isn't right.
This happened 7 years ago when my brother and I were 12. It was Christmas break, and we were visiting our grandma in Poland. Her village is surrounded by a large forest, and we loved taking walks there. One day, our mom asked us to take the dog out for a walk before it got dark. It was around 4 p.m. in winter, so the sun had almost set. We bundled up in our thick coats and shoes and headed out. As soon as we entered the forest, I felt uneasy, like something was watching us. I tried to shake off the feeling until I heard a woman scream. I looked at my brother to see if he heard it too, and by the look on his face, I could tell he did. We tried to convince ourselves it was just an animal and continued walking. But then we heard the scream 2 more times, each time getting closer. That's when we decided to run back home. We never told anyone about what happened. My brother jokingly suggested it might have been a skinwalker, though we knew those aren't known to be in this area. Could have been an animal, but the scream sounded so human. Even our dog was freaked out. To this day, we still don't know what it was.